It was late afternoon on Halloween, and the sky over Grady Lane had taken on that eerie orange hue that always seemed to signal the oncoming night. I stood by the window, watching as children in costumes ran up and down the street, laughing and chasing each other. They were all so full of life, completely oblivious to the passing of time that weighed so heavily on me. My house had grown quiet over the years. No one knocked on my door for candy anymore. The neighbours who once filled the street with their children's laughter had all moved away or passed on. My husband Harold had died years ago, and since then the world had felt colder, emptier. I could still picture him sitting on the front porch, carving pumpkins and handing out candy, his deep, warm laugh echoing in the cool October air. Those were happy times, times when the house was full of life and love. Now it was just me. At 6 o'clock I did what I always did on Halloween. I lit the old oil lamp on the mantel. It was a tradition Harold and I started the first Halloween we spent in this house. I didn't know why I kept it up. Maybe it was just my way of keeping a part of him with me. The lamp's soft glow filled the room, casting a warm, familiar light on the walls. But despite its comfort, something about tonight felt off. I couldn't quite place it, just a creeping sense of unease that seemed to be coming from the very walls themselves. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, and every creak of the house sent a chill down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as nerves. After all, it was Halloween. The night itself had a way of stirring up old fears. Around 8 o'clock, a knock at the door startled me. I hadn't expected anyone, not after so many years of being forgotten by trick-or-treaters. My heart raced as I shuffled to the door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, before finally pulling it open. There, standing on my porch, was a boy in a pirate costume. His face was hidden in the shadows, and for a moment I couldn't see his eyes. He didn't say anything, just stood there staring at me. The silence between us stretched out, and the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable I felt. "Trick or treat?" I asked, trying to break the tension, but the boy didn't respond. His stillness unnerved me, and I took a step back. "Are you okay, dear?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly, but still he didn't answer. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The wind picked up again, rattling the porch swing, and a cold chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. Closing the door behind me, I returned to the living room, glancing at the oil lamp on the mantel. Its flame flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows across the walls. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a boy playing a Halloween prank. But then, I smelled something sharp and acrid. Smoke. I froze. No sooner had I registered the smell than I saw it, a thin line of smoke curling under the front door. My heart leapt into my throat. I rushed to the window, my breath catching in my chest. Outside, flames were licking up the side of the house, bright and fierce. They were spreading fast, climbing the walls, devouring the wooden frame of the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what was happening. Someone had set my house on fire. Panicked, I ran to the front door and tried to open it, but the heat was too intense. The handle was burning hot, and when I pressed my hand against the door, it barely budged. Whoever had started the fire had blocked the door from the outside. My heart raced as I stumbled back, coughing as the smoke thickened in the air. The fire was spreading quickly, and the walls were already beginning to crack and groan under the heat. I had to get out, but every exit was blocked. The windows, they were my only hope. I ran to the nearest window, but the flames outside had already reached it. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke was so thick now that it was hard to breathe. I could feel my lungs burning, my vision starting to blur. Coughing, gasping for breath, I stumbled through the house, searching for another way out. The fire was everywhere now, closing in from all sides. I tried the back door, but the flames had already taken hold of the kitchen, and the handle was too hot to touch. I was trapped. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke suffocating. My body felt weak, my limbs heavy. I collapsed onto the floor, my hands trembling as I struggled to breathe. My vision darkened, and the last thing I heard was the crackling roar of the flames as they consumed everything around me. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of my living room. The fire was gone. The smoke, the heat, it was all gone. I pushed myself up slowly, my head spinning. The house looked normal. The furniture was in its place, the walls unscorched. The oil lamp on the mantel flickered gently, casting the same warm glow as before. I blinked, confused. Had it all been a dream? I stood up and walked to the window, expecting to see fire trucks or neighbours gathered outside. But the street was empty. Everything was still. I couldn't make sense of it. I could still smell the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air, but there was no sign of fire. No charred remains, no burned wood. Everything was as it had always been. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, or rather, I realized with growing horror, I couldn't feel my bones at all. My body felt strange, light, as if I were floating just above the ground. A cold dread gripped me as I raised a trembling hand to my chest. There was no heartbeat, no pulse. Panic surged through me, and I ran to the mirror in the hallway. But when I looked into it, I saw nothing, no reflection. I stumbled back, my mind racing. No, this couldn't be happening. I had to be dreaming. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the truth was impossible to ignore. I was dead. The fire hadn't spared me. Whoever had set it had killed me. I had died in my own home, and now I was a ghost, trapped in this place that had once been my sanctuary. I collapsed to the floor, my mind spinning, my heart aching with the weight of the realization. The fire had taken everything from me, my life, my home, my future. I was nothing more than a memory now, a shadow lingering in the place where I had lived and loved. As the night wore on, I sat in the quiet of the house, trying to make sense of what had happened. But as the hours passed, I began to notice something strange. Outside the window, figures moved in the darkness. Pale, translucent figures, drifting silently down the street. They were like me, ghosts. I wasn't alone. With a deep, shuddering breath, I rose to my feet. The cold emptiness still gnawed at me, but there was a strange comfort in knowing I wasn't the only one left behind. I wasn't the only one forgotten by the living world. And as the moon rose high over Grady Lane, I stepped through the front door, leaving the ruins of my old life behind, and joined the others in their silent, eternal walk.
I didn't want to be there that night. It was one of those chilly autumn evenings where the wind cuts through your jacket like a blade, making you shiver in a way that has nothing to do with the temperature. The leaves crunched beneath our boots as we trudged up the hill, dead reminders of what fall is all about: decay, endings, and the slow, steady crawl toward winter. And yet, there I was, surrounded by tombstones that poked out of the ground like crooked teeth in a corpse's mouth. Chris was up ahead, leading the pack, his flashlight flickering wildly as it bounced off the gravestones. Max followed close behind, a mischievous grin plastered on his face, eyes gleaming with the kind of excitement I never understood. Evan was the quiet one as usual, bringing up the rear with a cigarette dangling from his lips like he was too cool for all of this. And then there was me, Trevor, dragging my feet in the dirt, silently hoping someone would change their mind, call this off, suggest a pizza and movie night instead of defiling the dead. We crested the top of the hill and there it was, Raven's Rest Cemetery. Not the official name, of course, but that's what the locals called it. The place was ancient, older than the town itself, people said. The tombstones were cracked and weathered, the engravings worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. The trees that surrounded the graveyard were skeletal, their branches reaching out like fingers trying to snatch us as we passed. It was the kind of place you only hear about in whispered stories, the kind of place your parents warn you never to go to at night. But we were there anyway, because Max had something to prove, and the rest of us, myself included, despite my better judgment, couldn't say no. The gate was rusted but unlocked, its iron bars groaning as Chris pushed it open with a creak that seemed too loud in the stillness. The air felt different inside the cemetery, thicker, like stepping into a place forgotten by time, a place that didn't want us there. Max pulled out a can of spray paint, shaking it with a rattling sound that seemed to echo unnaturally, like the graveyard was amplifying every noise we made. "All right, boys, time to leave our mark." "Max, seriously, we don't need to do this," I said again, my voice firmer this time, though I wasn't fooling anyone. I could feel the fear creeping up my spine, icy fingers gripping tighter with every step we took among the graves. Max snorted, his eyes glinting under the pale moonlight. "What's the big deal, Trevor? They're dead. What the hell do they care if we have a little fun?" Chris joined him, already digging through his backpack for a hammer. "Yeah, man, stop being such a pussy. No one's gonna know we were even here." I knew I couldn't stop them. This was how it always went. But the pit in my stomach told me tonight was different. Tonight felt wrong. There was something about this place, something ancient, something angry. Max strode up to one of the larger headstones, a tall, crumbling monument that had likely been standing for centuries, and started shaking the can of paint again, the sound grating on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. I watched as he raised his arm, preparing to defile whatever poor soul rested beneath. My mouth opened to protest one last time, but before I could say anything, the wind picked up. It wasn't a normal gust, it was a shriek, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from the very ground beneath our feet. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Chris stopped rummaging through his bag and looked around, his brow furrowing. Even Evan flicked his cigarette away, suddenly more alert than he'd been all night. Max, though, just laughed. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just the wind." But I knew it wasn't. This wind had teeth. It clawed at our clothes, whipped through the trees, and carried with it a smell, something sickly sweet like rotting fruit or spoiled meat. It churned my stomach and made the hair on my neck stand on end. Max ignored it. Of course he did. He started to spray a bright red streak across the gravestone, his hand steady, almost proud. The hiss of the paint can seemed deafening in the strange silence that followed the wind's wail. But then, just as the first letter of his tag was complete, the ground shook. It was subtle at first, just a low rumble that made the pebbles around our feet dance. But it grew, the earth trembling beneath us like something was waking up, something deep, something old. "Max," I warned, stepping back instinctively. He waved me off, annoyed. "It's probably just a small quake or something, chill out." But it wasn't a quake. The ground beneath Max's feet cracked, tiny fissures spider-webbing out from where he stood. His face changed then. He wasn't laughing anymore. He took a step back, but the earth didn't let him go. The fissures widened, and suddenly, the ground wasn't just cracking, it was opening. "Guys?" Max said, panic creeping into his voice for the first time. The dirt beneath him shifted like a living thing, yawning open to reveal a gaping hole that wasn't just earth and stone. It was darkness. Endless, hungry darkness. Max's legs buckled, and he stumbled, one foot sliding into the blackness. "Max!" Chris shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. The ground opened wider, and Max was swallowed whole. His scream cut through the night, sharp and desperate, but it was over in an instant. 1 second he was there, and the next, he was gone. The earth closed back up like a mouth that had just finished its meal. For a moment, none of us moved. None of us breathed. "What the fuck just happened?" Chris shouted, his face pale. He dropped the hammer, his hands shaking as he backed away from the spot where Max had been standing. "What the fuck just—" The ground trembled again, more violently this time. The air felt charged, electric, like a storm was building right under our feet. "We need to get out of here," Evan said, his voice low but calm in a way that terrified me even more. Chris didn't need any more convincing. He turned and bolted for the gate, Evan right behind him. I stood frozen for a second longer, my eyes locked on the place where Max had vanished. The grave he'd tried to vandalize seemed different now. The letters on the headstone were no longer worn smooth. They were sharp and clear, the name etched into the stone like it had just been carved yesterday. But it wasn't the name that caught my eye. It was the epitaph. "Disturb not the slumber of the dead, lest they awaken in hunger and wrath." My heart lurched in my chest, and I turned to run. The cemetery wasn't letting us go that easily, though. The wind howled, the trees groaned, and the ground moved. Graves shifted, tombstones leaned toward us like they were reaching out, and the earth rippled beneath my feet as if many things were stirring beneath. Chris was almost at the gate when the iron bars slammed shut with a deafening clang, locking us in. He grabbed the bars, pulling and shaking them, screaming in frustration, but they wouldn't budge. "We're trapped," Evan muttered, staring at the gate like it was a death sentence. I backed away from the shifting ground, my mind racing. "We've got to find another way out." Chris looked at me with wild eyes. "Another way? There is no other way." Evan was staring at something behind us, his eyes wide. "Trevor, look." I turned slowly, my stomach dropping as I saw what he was staring at. The graves. The graves were opening. One by one, dirt crumbled away as skeletal hands emerged from the earth, clawing their way to the surface. Rotten flesh hung from yellowed bones, empty eye sockets gleaming with an unnatural light. "They're coming," Evan whispered, backing up. I grabbed him by the arm and pulled him toward the trees. "Run!" We sprinted toward the far end of the cemetery, dodging between gravestones, the undead clawing their way up behind us. I could hear Chris screaming, but I didn't stop to look back. I couldn't. I wouldn't. The trees loomed ahead, their twisted branches beckoning us like skeletal hands of their own. We crashed through the undergrowth, the darkness swallowing us whole. The wind howled, and the sounds of pursuit faded behind us. But I didn't stop running. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the cemetery was nothing but a dark, distant memory. Max was gone. Chris was gone. I didn't know if Evan was behind me or if he'd been lost in the chaos. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had escaped. But at what cost? I could still feel the earth trembling beneath my feet, as though the graveyard was still awake, still hungry, and I knew deep down that it wasn't over.
I'll never forget the first time I saw him. It was Halloween night, and the sky had that particular bruised look, like a welt rising on the horizon, the purples and blacks pushing in from all sides. I'd always loved this time of year, the way everything felt just a little more alive, or maybe haunted. The streets were filled with children in costumes, their voices bubbling up like champagne in the cool night air. But it wasn't the laughing kids or the rustling leaves that caught my attention. It was the cat. At first, it was just a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye as I was taking out the trash. The porch light flickered as I pushed the lid down on the garbage can, and there, perched on the edge of the stone wall that separated my yard from the woods, was a black cat. Its fur was sleek, so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, leaving nothing but an inky outline against the night. Its eyes, though, that's what really held me. They were a sickly yellow, burning with an intelligence that felt far too human. I remember smiling at it despite the unease gnawing at the base of my spine. I've always been an animal lover, the kind of person who feeds the strays and worries about lost dogs in thunderstorms. So I crouched down, my voice soft. "Hey there," I called. "You hungry?" The cat tilted its head, and for a moment I swore it understood me. It slinked down from the wall with unnatural grace, each step purposeful and silent. When it reached me, it looked up, and I swear I saw something deeper in those eyes, something ancient. I shook the thought away, chuckling nervously as I headed back into the house. "I'll get you something to eat." Inside, I found an old can of tuna and scooped some into a dish. When I returned, the cat was sitting exactly where I'd left it, like it hadn't moved a muscle. It watched me as I set the dish down, never blinking, its gaze so intense I could feel it in my bones. "There you go," I muttered, stepping back. The cat approached the dish, sniffing it delicately before devouring the food with savage bites. I watched it for a moment, something uneasy rolling in my stomach, then shook my head and went back inside, locking the door behind me. But the cat stayed. The next morning, I found it on my porch, curled up like it had been waiting for me all night. The yellow eyes snapped open the moment I stepped outside, following my every movement. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was studying me. Still, there was something pathetic about it, sitting there all alone in the cold. "You've got no one else, huh?" I sighed. "I'll take care of you." By the third day the cat had made itself at home. I named him Salem, a little joke that felt funnier when he didn't make me feel so uneasy. He followed me around the house like a shadow, always watching. His presence was constant, a weight pressing down on every room I entered. But I figured that's just how cats were, aloof, mysterious. That's what everyone says, right? Then things started to get strange. At first it was little things. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find Salem sitting at the foot of my bed, his yellow eyes glowing in the dark. He'd never blink, never make a sound. Just sit there, watching, as if he was waiting for something. Then there were the dreams. They started slow, a flash of black fur, the gleam of fangs in the moonlight. But soon they grew darker. In my dreams, Salem wasn't a cat at all. He was something else, something bigger, with twisted limbs and too many eyes. He'd crawl out of the shadows, his mouth stretching into a grin full of jagged teeth, and whisper things I couldn't understand but made my skin crawl nonetheless. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the feeling of his breath still warm on my neck, only to find him sitting there on the bed, staring. By the end of the week, Salem wasn't the only one watching me. I'd see things from the corner of my eye, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, faces flickering in the glass of my windows at night. The air in the house felt thick, almost suffocating. I could swear I heard whispers, faint and distant, echoing through the walls. One night, I came home late from work, my head pounding from a long day. As soon as I opened the door, the smell hit me, rotten, like something had died in the walls. I gagged, covering my mouth, and flipped on the lights. Salem was sitting in the middle of the living room, staring up at me. But it wasn't just him. The floor around him was littered with things, little offerings, like a trail of dead mice and birds, each of them arranged with unsettling precision. The worst part, they weren't fresh. They looked like they'd been decomposing for days, their bodies bloated, eyes missing. "What the hell, Salem?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I cleaned it all up, gagging as I did, and tossed the remains in the trash. That night, the dreams were worse. Salem's voice was louder now, clearer, and this time I understood what he was saying. "I'm coming," he whispered, the words slithering through the dark like a snake. "Soon." It got worse after that. The feeling of being watched followed me everywhere, even outside the house. People at work started to comment on how tired I looked, how distracted I seemed. I couldn't tell them what was really happening. They'd think I was losing it. Hell, maybe I was. One evening, I came home to find every window in the house open, though I'd sworn I'd shut them all before I left. The air inside was freezing, the curtains fluttering like something had just passed through, and there, in the center of my kitchen, was Salem. Only, it wasn't him anymore. His body was twisted, bones jutting out at unnatural angles, his fur matted with something dark and wet. His eyes, those sickly yellow eyes, were glowing brighter now, almost pulsing with light. His mouth had split wide, far too wide, revealing row after row of jagged teeth. He wasn't sitting like a cat anymore. He was standing, his limbs unnaturally long, his head cocked at an impossible angle. "Salem?" My voice came out in a trembling whisper. The thing that had been Salem took a step toward me, its claws clicking against the floor like nails on glass. "I'm coming," it rasped, its voice no longer the whisper of dreams, but a guttural, inhuman growl. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't know where to go, didn't know how to fight something like this. It wasn't just a cat anymore. It was something else, something wrong. As I backed into the corner of the kitchen, Salem, or whatever he had become, began to change again. His body twisted, the bones beneath his fur cracking and shifting. His skin split open like old leather, and from within, something monstrous emerged. It was tall, towering over me, its body covered in slick black scales. Its face was no longer feline, but a grotesque mask of twisted features. Horns, too many eyes, and a mouth full of teeth that seemed to stretch forever. "You brought me here," it hissed, its voice a cacophony of whispers and growls. "You let me in." I screamed then, the sound tearing from my throat as I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, only that I needed to get away. But as I reached the front door, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost bloomed across the walls, and the air became thick, almost tangible, like I was trying to run through molasses. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been Salem. Its heavy, wet footsteps slapped against the floor, and its voice, God, that voice, was in my head, inside me, filling every corner of my mind. "You can't escape," it whispered. "You invited me in. I am bound to you." I stumbled into the living room, the front door just inches away, when the lights flickered and died. In the dark, I could feel it, the heat of its breath on the back of my neck. This was it. There was no escaping it now. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling, and as I turned it, I felt the cold, slick hand of the thing wrap around my wrist. "You're mine," it growled, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was on the floor of my living room. The house was silent. The windows were closed, everything was normal. No smell of rot, no dead animals, no frost. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator. But Salem was gone. I looked for him for days, scouring the woods behind my house, calling his name, but there was nothing. No sign he had ever been here. But I know the truth. Sometimes late at night, I'll hear a soft scratching at my window, like claws on glass. And when I look just for a second, I'll see those yellow eyes watching me from the dark, waiting, because I know this isn't over. Not yet.